Hi, welcome to the third video for the Woodland patch quilt that I'm making with these delicious fabrics from Newtex in New Zealand called Woodland Friends. They've got lovely foxes and bunnies and things on. So we've been making the quilt, we've done all the blocks and things, we saw all that in the last video. This time I'm just going to talk a little bit about the quilting. So I've already pin basted it. I use safety pins to baste and they're sort of approximately 4 inches apart throughout the quilt. I've got a backing on, I've got a label and all those sorts of things, and now I'm going to do some quilting. I tend to like free motion quilting, but I'm going to do some straight lines in my borders here to hold everything, and then I'm going to probably maybe do some wiggly parallel lines down my panels of blocks. I'm probably going to echo a little bit in the white triangles and maybe just go around within the squares. And then on the border I might echo these triangles and I might do some wiggly lines out in the white again. But I do change my mind sometimes when I'm quilting. That's my thoughts at the moment. We'll see how it goes and I'll show you what I'm up to as I go. So I think that's about it for the moment, and I'll come back to you very shortly with what I'm actually doing. So I've finished doing all the quilting. I have done what I was thinking I would do. I've done some straight lines in the borders. I've done a little bit of echo in the triangles. I've done some wiggly parallel lines just coming out diagonally in the border. I've echoed a little inside the square here and these triangles, and I've done some wiggly parallel lines down here. So that's all looking pretty good. I've managed to keep everything nice and square. As I've mentioned previously, just keep an eye on your edge because it is all on the bias. It may help you to do a line of stitching, like a basting line, before you do too much quilting, if that's going to hold it together for you right round that edge. Other than that, I think we're ready to do the binding. So I've already prepared my binding strips. I've got one long strip here. I like to join my binding with a diagonal seam so that it sits nice and flat and it kind of spreads the load of the seam over the binding as it turns around. I'm going to start off with one end, which I've already pressed in, and I'm just going to trim this excess off here. And I'm going to just stitch it onto the back because I'm going to stitch mine down by machine as well. If you're going to stitch down by hand, you'll want to stitch it onto the front. First of all, so I'm going to do this, I'm going to get started here. I'm going to start stitching with the binding wide open, and I'm just going to stitch along to just past that folded bit. Then I'm going to leave a gap of 2 or 3 inches. I'm going to fold my binding over and then start stitching from here, so leaving that little bit open, and that's so that when we get around to the other end we can just tuck that into there. And at the corners I'm just going to get to them as we usually do when I get to a corner, when I find one. So we'll be folding. I don't generally press my binding over before I start. That's my preferred method. I know a lot of people like to. I feel that because we're actually going to be rolling it over, that it rolls to a better edge if I haven't pre-pressed it, but as I said, that's a personal preference. When I get to the corner, I'm going to come right up and stop sewing 1/4 inch before the end of the quilt. Take it out of, finish off, like tie off, take it out of the machine, and I'm going to fold that over so that it goes over, so that the fold goes right through the corner of the quilt. And then fold it back down again and start stitching right at the end and come all the way along, and that just leaves you this funny little corner here, but you'll find that it turns over and makes a nice mitre. So that works really well. The other thing I'm doing is using a walking foot on my sewing machine so that it feeds through nicely, because we've got all this thickness in here that's a little bit spongy. What the walking foot does is it feeds from underneath as normal sewing machines do, but the foot feeds on top as well, so everything feeds more evenly through, and I find that works really well for that. So I'll go ahead, put the binding on, and then I'll show you the completed quilt. So I've done my little start here. I'm not sure if you can see this. I've started and I've stopped, as I said, just at the end of that folded part. I've left a gap, and then I've folded over my fabric and I've started sewing along here now. So I thought I'd just quickly show you how to do the corner so that everything is sitting nicely. So I'm coming up towards the corner now, and I'm going to stop sewing a 1/4 of an inch before I get to the end of the quilt. So if you need to pop a pin in there, that would be fine. Otherwise you can just make a little judgment. And I'm going to finish it off with a little back stitch. Take it out of the machine. Fold the fabric over so that the diagonal fold goes right through the corner of the quilt. Fold it back again so the fold is level with the edge of the quilt. Turn the quilt around and start sewing right from the end there. And then go all the way along this side to the next corner and do the same thing again. So I'm just about back where I started now. So I'm finishing off stitching this binding around onto the back. I'm using my walking foot. Now you may have a dual feed on your machine which will do the same sort of job. This machine doesn't have a dual feed, so we have the walking foot to help us get it through. The other thing I should mention, when I'm putting my bindings on, I do apply just a very small amount of tension to the binding piece. Not tight. You don't want to pull it really tight and therefore cause it to be too tight, but you don't want it so that it's all sort of floppy either. You just want it so that it sits nice and just holds that edge nice and firmly for you. So my little starting point is just coming up here. So I'm just going to keep sewing until I get to it, and then I'm going to trim off and tuck that end in. So there we are, we're back at it there now. So I'm going to get my scissors, and I'm just going to have them ready here, and I'm going to start sewing onto that point. Then take my scissors, and so my opening comes all the way back to here. Hopefully you can see all this, and I'm just going to trim it so that it sits within that. You don't need it to go all the way up to the edge, but you do need it to sit within so that it's covered nicely. And then I'm going to tuck that into that fold and have all the raw edges even. Make sure that tucks in all the way along there, and then bring this folded bit back again so that the edges are all nice and even and it's sitting nice and flat there. And then just finish that off, keep sewing till you get back to where you started when we were putting the binding on. And then just finish that off, take it out of the machine. And the only other thing that I do at this stage is where that's doubled over, that's quite bulky. So I might just trim away some of the excess that we have tucked in there, just to stop the bulk causing a problem when we fold the binding over. Sometimes it can make quite a bump there. Depends a little bit on the fabric and batting and things. But I just find if I just trim that back, that helps me have a nice edge when I'm folding that round to the front. So now we're going to be able to fold that all to the front. So now we can fold the binding round to the front as we do, unless you're doing it in reverse of course, and you're going to stitch it down to the back. I'm going to machine stitch mine down onto the front so I can flip it over like that. Now it doesn't really matter where you start on a quilt when you're doing this part of it, so I'm just going to start down here somewhere near a corner so that I can show you just how I go around those corners. So I'm just flipping that over, and I'll go to the machine again. So I'm just stitching down near the fold of the binding. up to the corner. So now the corner, when we flip that over, because it's got a funny little bit there, will actually end up giving us a very nice little mitre when we tuck that in. Hold the fold all the way out to the edge of the binding until you get a little bit closer. Now you could pop a pin in here if you'd like to hold that down, or you can just fold that over so that you end up with a nice little mitre in the fold there, so that you stitch up to it, and I stitch onto that point that's come over forming the mitre. Oops. And leave the needle in, and I swivel the quilt around, and then I tend to just do a little back stitch just to hold that corner, just that little bit, and then I continue on all the way along to do the next side until the next corner. So you can see that you get this nice little folded mitre, it sits nicely, and I'm very happy with that as my corner. Well, here we have the quilt finished. I'm pretty thrilled with it. I've finished all the quilting, the binding's sitting nicely, the corners are sitting nicely, all the quilting looks good, the patches look good, the fabrics look amazing. They're just such a lovely range of fabrics, and I've put a label on the back of my quilt so that I know what fabrics. I like to often put the selvages of the fabrics I've used and my name so that I know what fabrics I've used. So all in all, we have a nice woodland patch quilt. It's approximately 60 inches square, I think, and it will just do for so many purposes that you need a quilt for, which is pretty much everything in life. So that's the Woodland Friends range of fabrics from Nutex. The threads I've been sewing with have been Oracle threads, and the pattern for Woodland Patch is available from my website, GourmetQuilter.com, or a quilt shop near you. So please do have a look for that, and thank you.